This is one of my favorite things to do, is the occasional Q&A. Just every so often it's good for us, maybe on a quarterly basis. And I was prompted last night, no, I should make it, this is a quick Q&A time, because we're kind of in between one component and another. We've completed that series on Job and looking at the wonders of the natural world. And I want more and more to empower and encourage people to love God through his world, through the beauty of the world itself. And you've seen, we've looked at glorious things. I keep coming up and finding new things. And it's just exquisite. The more you learn, the more astonished you become. In fact, I want to use nature, the analog world, and I'm going to be using the digital world to drive people to the analog world. So I'm going to be creating resources that will actually draw them into like a kind of a museum of beauty, bring them into a room. And there you go, and you see these caterpillars or butterflies. Another room is going to be seashells, and go on and on. You could go all over the place, and one marvel after another. And in doing so, if I can actually use that to actually draw them through that beauty into a greater sense of reality, because we become more and more digitized, and as a consequence, less and less connected with this world. AI is a useful servant, but a very poor master. And so you have to see that, and when you see kids getting wrapped up into the digital world and where they get more and more away from this real world, if I can bring them back into that beauty, and so, because it's infinitely more complex and wonderful than anything that we ourselves can make. Just one illustration of this, and we'll go to the Q&A. I mean, look at this crazy thing. These are actually frog leg beetles. You see these frog legs? What are they doing with those things? You see? And so the interesting thing, though, is the fact that you see this collection and that organization, and what do you conclude when you look at them? You'd conclude, oh, somebody put them there that way, you see. In other words, you'd look at this collection here, and you'd say, these are all beetles. Oh, it's obvious, though, that some intelligent design was involved in making them a collection in that order. Would you not agree? It's pretty obvious. But nobody thinks about the fact that these are infinitely more complex than that design that we're talking about. And we can't begin to imagine these marvels and wonders. And yet we attribute them to the impersonal plus time and chance, mutations and natural selection. It's intriguing, isn't it, how that works? So given that, I want us to actually have a greater sense of the glory and the beauty of the living God, and to see his wonders that are displayed abundantly throughout the world. Before I begin, I wanted to just pass out. This is show and tell. I love it. This arrived yesterday when I came back from Tampa. I was doing the day of prayer for Idlewild Church in Tampa, a big church there. And the Inspirata Publishing, I now have a relationship with this Chinese publisher. They work out of Hong Kong. And this particular book is two different versions of the same book. This one is Handbook to Scripture, and there's a traditional version. And I can tell the difference. I can really see. I have to proofread these things. You see the Chinese, right? And then this is simplified. So it's both of them are, and this one's shaped by suffering. So I'll just pass them around just for you to see. But when I see these things, it gives me great pleasure to think that people are using this now in Asia, and this company is going to be doing that and getting other resources and handbooks and so forth, so that can be a thing that's used to build up the body of believers in that way. Okay, what questions do you have? Yes.
I'm 83 and I'm looking forward to going home.
As am I. We all ought to be getting more homesick. I don't care how old you are. You have to train yourself to be homesick, because you're not home. You see, what are the metaphors? We're pilgrims. Let's give me another metaphor. I've given them to you before. Sojourners is the second one. Biblical metaphors of this earthbound life. You're a pilgrim, You're a sojourner, you're a wayfarer, you're an alien, you're a stranger, you're an exile. Isn't that interesting? All those metaphors in Scripture to describe the pilgrim context of this life and how brief, how transitory, how ephemeral, and yet everything matters, and what we do now really will endure. That's why people like that line from Gladiator, remember? And he says, what we do today echoes in eternity. And there's truth in that. So today matters. But continue with that journey of desire.
I would like your thoughts about what's going to be our ultimate purpose when we are in heaven.
Oh, that's a great thought. We're going to be gardeners. All of us are going to be gardeners. This guy is gardening insects. See, he puts them in order. He puts them in a sequence. When you go out into nature, you're not going to see a herbaceous border. You're not going to see a rose garden. These are things that we make. God chooses not to make cathedrals. He chooses not to write a symphony or a concerto. He does that in us, through us. You see the concept? We take his mysterious world on every order of magnitude. It's beyond our comprehension. In fact, the more you learn and the more you begin to see the pattern, the more fearful it becomes, the more astonishing it becomes, the more awesome it becomes. And yet at the same time, you and I are image bearers. And because we're image bearers, because we are spiritual beings, but we're also creative beings, we're moral beings, we're aesthetic beings, we have all these dynamics because of the image of God, he wishes to use and takes pleasure in our unique capacities to do things that no one else can do. Every one of you here will reflect and refract the glory of Jesus in a way that no one else does, in a unique way. Something no two are alike, and that's what nature shows. You look at this infinite variety. And so when I say you're a gardener, remember at the very beginning, what were they supposed to do? And this is before the fall. They were supposed to cultivate, and they were supposed to, and it was actually, the word used there is worship, and it had to do with the service of God. And so it was their worship to actually reflect back through their personality the works of God, you see, and make things that brought into being things that didn't exist. And that's what you can do too. Some of you have brought into being, perhaps a company. And that company created added value that didn't exist before, that enhanced people's lives. And you see where I'm going with that? And that way, you're taking that and you're bringing into being something that didn't exist before. I think we're going to do that forever. But consider this, though. If there's a pleasure, and remember that wonderful line from Chariots of Fire. Did we set our time yet on when we're going to do it?
No, we're waiting.
Okay. I'm probably going to teach that film. But in Chariots of Fire, he says, Eric Liddell says, when God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast, for China, but he says he also made me fast. And when I run, what does he say? I feel his pleasure. What is it that when you do it, you feel the pleasure of God? And if you haven't asked that question, start wrestling with it. What is it that when I do? And ask the Spirit, guide me so that I can do what is the place that you've called me to be. Because the place God calls you to is that place where your deep pleasure and the world's deep needs intersect. You see, so there's a connection there. So you're going to consider a world that's painless, tearless, deathless, no injury, no death, no sickness. Consider a world like that. Consider that you're going to be in a resurrected body, that your capacity, your cognitive capacity will be vastly greater than it is right now, because we lost much at the fall. And that you're now going to be freed also from the bondage of these three things: the world, system, the flesh, and the devil. And you're going to be in a resurrected body, and in a context of total restoration. Behold, I make all things new. it'll be a new order of physics. It's astonishing. I can't imagine it, because eye hasn't seen, nor ear heard, nor has entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for those who love him. So, but you're not going to be disappointed. But you can't imagine it yet. We don't have the capacity. So I do say this, though, that we have analogies. And just as you can take pleasure in creating something and crafting something and making something that's good and valuable, so also you'll be doing that in the ages to come. I can tell you this, there's a lot of things that I want to do that I know I won't be able to do in this life. You see, it goes back to that Tozer quote. The days of the years of our life are few and swifter than a weaver's shuttle. Life is a short and fevered rehearsal for a concert we cannot stay to give. Just when we've attained proficiency, we're forced to lay our instruments down. There's not enough time, enough opportunity to do all that we know that the constitution of our nature tells us we're capable of doing. But eternal years are in his hands, and indeed, when this world is gone, we will still be here. You see, we will still be in the new creation. So it's a wonderful thought, isn't it? So what do you love to do? There's some things I'd love to be able to do. I'd like to have various parts of me. One of me wants to be an artist full time. Another one wants to be a photographer. One wants to be a poet. One wants to be a composer, and so it goes. There's many things I'd like to do, learn. I don't have time. Everything I choose to do is one thing less than I can do. So I have to choose in this life, because of the boundaries, what's the thing the key thing, you see, that sweet spot, that place where you're called to be. And that's a good prayer request. I rambled too long on that question. Yeah.
And I've talked to you about this before, but Christianity is growing now at a faster per capita rate than any time since the Roman Empire.
That's correct. Did you all hear that? Christianity is growing faster now than in any previous time in the history of Christianity. It's mostly in the global south, as they call it. But it's astonishing. But there's also unprecedented degrees of persecution. So both are occurring.
Well, there's more Christians in China now than there are members of the Communist Party. It's like there's a divine spirit sweeping over Asia. And what is this indicative of? Is this the history of Christianity? Is this the beginning of the end?
Well, yes. He's saying he's looking at Asia, and in fact, many of the Christians there in China. And what's one of the best? The worst thing that could happen to them. This will sound strange. Would be for the state to approve Christianity. It'd be a disaster to them. You see, the fact that they are forced to be underground is what gives them their power and their vitality. And indeed, there's probably about 100 million of them now. When I say a believer, you got to be serious about it. This is not just some perfunctory thing you're doing. This is a life risk. And indeed, many of them now have this vision of bringing it along the Silk Road and back to where it began. So going through that direction. And if anyone can do it, they'd be the ones. Because you see, the gospel began in the ancient Near East, and then it went into the Roman Empire through there, and then ultimately it spread over to America, where there were great missions movements, and around the rest of the world and so forth. But then the places where it was in Europe seems to have diminished, and almost in some cases, Ichabod, the glory has departed. And yet there's still a faithful remnant in that. But so it is with America as well now. We've diminished, and it's as if the baton has been passed on, you see, away from us. Now there's still the idea that there's always going to be a faithful remnant. And I think it's always that faithful remnant that sustains a people beyond their warrant and their merit and their desert. But still, at the end of the day, the Spirit of God has moved, and it's moved into the global south primarily. And that's Asia, Africa, South America. Remarkable things are happening. So I think it's an exciting time because we see the day drawing near, and the curtain is being set. You see, the stage is being set for the next act. But I think that the longing we have to really see our call, our purpose. We are people, and I want you to be men of purpose. You want to live well, you want to transition well, you want to finish well. But at the same time, all of that is preparation for home. That's all of this whole thing. Remember, I call it a soul-forming world. Where are you in your deepest self right now? I've been stressing this again and again. Where are you, according to Scripture, in your deepest self, in your spirit? You're seated with Him at the right hand of the Father in the heavenly places. I don't feel that way. It doesn't ask you to feel that way. You reckon it to be true. This is your deepest self. And indeed, in that context, you are holy and righteous and declared to be so. You're perfect in His sight. But in this world, our soul, our minds, our wills, our emotions, our imaginations, they are not perfect, and they need to be brought into greater conformity with the image of Christ, so that, as we've been stressing, our call in this world is to become more and more in our practice who we already are in our position. Because you're a new being, that's who you are in the heavenlies, but you're a becomer in this world. You see the difference between the two? That your soul is now, we're called then to become in our practice. And so it's a soul-forming world, and we are shaped by suffering. And God uses that adversity as the crucible to actually drive us to greater dependence upon Him and love for Him, and at the same time purging and purifying us in preparation for home. Because I want you to live with 2 days in your calendar. You know, I've told you this again and again. What are the 2 days? Today, which is all you've got. You don't have yesterday, you don't have tomorrow. All you have is this day. Live this day as if it's all you, and give it all you've got. Wherever you are, be all there. Live to the hilt any situation you believe to be the will of God. And then there's that day, the day when you're going to encounter Jesus at the judgment seat. And so live in light of that. Yes?
Yeah, I just, could you apply that to the mess we've got our country in today? I mean, should we take a pacifistic view, or should we be active? I mean, it's a mess.
It is a mess. And again, the context that I talk about cultural diminishment here, and it's actually incredible when I look at this. There's this message, and I can send it to you, Dennis, if you want. I think we sent this to you before, but this is something I sent out to some friends maybe a few months ago, where I wrote, Karen and I saw something the other night that brought us back into the world of the 1980s. It was evident that serious socio-cultural problems were being promulgated at that time, but we were both surprised to note how minor they appeared in comparison to our contemporary milieu. Bad as that was, you can't believe it. You wouldn't have believed it, you see, if you'd certain. The accelerating cultural diminishment, and then due to a collection of mutually reinforcing strands that are woven together in unprecedented ways. We have a diminished capacity for rational and evidential processing, to say nothing of common sense. In the past 70 plus years, the perfect storm combining multiple forces that are unique in human history. And so I discussed what those look like a little bit, and but essentially, in addition to all these crazy kinds of things that are occurring that are in many ways unprecedented, and we have also, in addition to that, a loss of civility, authentic tolerance, and it's a matter of time before Christianity will be more and more overtly persecuted, you see. It's already happening. In England, just two days ago, Karen was reading in the London Times how a pastor was actually arrested for actually offending people by saying that marriage is supposed to be between a man and a woman. Now, let's go one step. Jesus said that. So when do we get to the point where we're going to overtly say that Jesus himself is now to be vilified? You see the point? So how do we deal with this? What we do is we pray for our country. We are light, agents of light and salt in this world. So I can't change this overall, but I can be a faithful presence and a faithful witness in my sphere of influence. It's too big. It's bigger than, but God has called you for such a time as this. Every one of you has a purpose. He knew you before you were born. He determined the number of your days before you were even here. And as a consequence of that, you realize that he has called you for a purpose. He's gifted you. He's called you and given you a sphere of influence, certain capacities and abilities. And as a consequence of that, you can be a faithful presence. And then in doing that, I can't control the whole. I think that actually we've gone past the tipping point. But that still doesn't mean there can't be a revival. There can't be some things that will happen. We continue to pray for our nation and all of that. Faithful presence. But don't be naive and unrealistic. The fact is that the tipping point has been passed. Now, the only reason why we're still here is because of there's a faithful remnant. But at the end of the day, God's never been committed to this country as he has been to a theocratic covenant nation, Israel. But that said, this country has, in my view, been unique in the history of the world in many ways because of its foundation and because of its influence and its impact. And it's a tragic and sad thing. I'm old enough to remember things as they once were. And I don't want to idealize those days because there were obvious problems, but there was at least a moral consensus. And there were certain things that were valued that are no longer treasured, and there's this diminishment. So rather than wring my hands, I want to be a faithful presence. I want to be a salt and light in this dark world. And that to me is so I can't manage the whole. Just as when you go down, say I go into an inner city, and I see the streets, if you were aware of all the pain in that one block, you'd be overwhelmed. You couldn't endure it. But God gives us burdens corresponding with our calling. You see the concept there? So if you have a particular burden, and it doesn't mean that everyone else has to have that particular prescription, you see. Some people will be burdened on one issue, more on another, and so forth. We have a calling and a unique thing. So be a faithful presence in your sphere of influence and look at the history of where you've been and where that might lead. So that to me is where we are. So we are realistic. Again, you know, I'm a pessimistic optimist, as I've told you before. It's going to get a lot worse, but it's going to end well. There was a... yes?
Do you believe, what's your own opinion on whether we will be called before the tribulation?
Okay, I have my own views on this, and I can share, but I won't go into detail because this is a Q&A session. So my problem with Q&A, love it, it's my favorite thing, but then I have to be careful to monitor myself or I'll just go on and do a whole talk on one question, and I don't want to do that. But this is an example here. This is a slide from my presentation, which you can go to. It's on the seven feasts of Israel. You just go to kenboa.org, just type in feasts of Israel. You look at it. And it's interesting because you see the four spring feasts were actually fulfilled literally and on those actual days, so that you had that, and they concerned clearly the first advent of Christ. So you had Passover and unleavened bread and first fruits, and then Pentecost. And they all specifically were fulfilled in that manner. Passover, he died on Passover. And then he is raised from the dead on the first fruits. He's the first fruits of those who sleep. He fulfilled the typology, and everyone knows that they were fulfilled literally. And the question is, the fall feast, will they be fulfilled literally? Why wouldn't they be? And so if they are going to be fulfilled literally, it means then, because you have Rosh Hashanah, and then you have the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and then you have the Feast of Booths. So the whole idea there, they symbolize various things. One symbolizes the regathering of Israel, one then the purgation, and the judgment of the sheep and the goats as well. And then the other is going to be related to the second advent of the Lord, or after that, where he reigns and rules. You see, he comes as the reigning king. And so there's a summer gap, and we're living in that summer gap right now. The clock, the prophetic clock stopped at the triumphal entry. That was the day, if you'd only known the day of your visitation. I discuss it very detailed in that series. And you could actually show that he came on the very day that was predicted. It's an astonishing thing. If you'd only known the day of your visit. But he also said, because it was a bona fide offer, but I know you're going to reject me. It was very clear. And you're going to reject your Messiah because you wanted the Messiah that you've read about, who is the coming king. But they ignored the suffering servant. Who wants a suffering servant when you can have a coming king? When you can have someone who's going to deliver you from the bondage of Rome? So they failed to see him. And so the very same crowd that said, Hosanna, on that Sunday, most of those same people said, crucify him then on that Friday. So it's intriguing how that would be. But this is all in fulfillment. There's no surprise. God's not ringing in. I wonder what's going to happen. I hope they do. None of that nonsense. The Lord reigns supreme, and he raises up kings and deposes them. He determines the times and the seasons. My view, therefore, is that there will be a literal fulfillment. If that's true, then, when was the church birthed? What was the day of the birth of the church? The first day of the summer gap. Because the church has nothing to do with the day of judgment, the day of what we call the tribulation or the 7 year. That it's not going to be a part of that, because the purpose of the day of the Lord is the judgment of the nations and also the purgation and purification of Israel. So they will finally cry out, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And they're going to use Isaiah 53 as what they're going to say. Read Isaiah 53, it's what they're going to say when they say that. And so my view, therefore, is that the church has nothing to do with that. It was a mystery. It wasn't even mentioned. And it was there. It's a purpose that God had that was not known. And we're in the middle of that summer gap. And that means, therefore, that since it was birthed on Pentecost, my own view, I can't prove this, is that there's a probabilistic spike. There's on the day of Pentecost, from my view. I can't say. He could come at any day, but I think that every year there's a probabilistic spike that is going to be on a Pentecost, because the very day he birthed us is the day he's going to take us away, my view. And then if that were to happen, let's say next year, what's Pentecost? Isn't it the 16th, I think it is? So coming up very soon. Karen keeps asking me about this, but I suspect, but how do I know? But I live each year as if it's going to be this year. And I plan that way. So I live as if it's going to be this Pentecost that he's going to take us home. The Spirit and the bride say, come. And when he comes for us, by the way, that will precipitate events that would lead to the rise of the Antichrist, because of the absolute turmoil and chaos when hundreds of millions of people suddenly disappear. I'll let you work that out. But the point is that could occur. So I live as if it's going to be this Pentecost, but I plan as if it's not. You see? So if this Pentecost comes and goes, we have another year. And then I go to that Pentecost. That's how I do it. So I can be a date setter without being a date setter. So that's what I like about that. But that's another story. But that's a whole discussion in itself. I don't know if it helps any. Yeah. But so you can see I'm a pre-tribulationist. That's where I come from. Yeah.
I have one question. It seems today, with everything that's going on, there seems to be a lot of the Christian community thinking we got to start fighting back about things that we see going on. But what I wonder sometimes is it really that we really don't understand how important it would be for us to just humble ourselves and get on our knees and really pour our hearts out to God about what's going on, because he can accomplish more in 2 seconds than we can with all the fighting we want to do.
Of course.
Sometimes the way we're fighting doesn't set much of a witness. It sure isn't Christ-like.
No, I'm sorry to say you're right.
I'm concerned that the Christian communities has this great opportunity to be a witness, and instead of being a Christ-like witness, we're really a worldly witness.
I'm afraid you're right. You all hear that? He's talking about the fact that we are not really witnessing as we ought to. I believe that you and I should be known for what we love and not what we don't love. What we're for, not what we're against. You see, if I'm talking to a person who is, let's say it's a transsexual, I'm not going to talk about that issue. I'm going to talk about Jesus. Because if I can get them to love Jesus and to see him and the one who loves us in spite of ourselves and in spite of myself, then we're on common ground. You see, we were all given grace beyond our warrant and our merit and our desert. If I can get them to Jesus, we'll leave that in his hands. You see where I'm going with it? When Karen and I, for example, were working with a bunch of hippies and they were on drugs when I was in seminary, because it took one to know one, that was my background, we never told them to get off drugs. We told them about Jesus. One by one, they would then just say, hey, I've got now I found him, I don't need this. You see, it's the expulsive power of a new affection. Remember that phrase? The expulsive power. So what you want to do is tell them what they should love, not what they should loathe. In other words, I want you to be winsome. I want you to be attractive. Yes, Jake.
They're just asking on Zoom if you could repeat the questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to repeat the questions. Yes, a little late now, but I'll do my best. I'm very bad at this. Yes.
Do you believe in life outside of Earth?
Oh, he's saying, do you believe in life outside of this earth? My own view of the fine-tuning arguments in the last, especially 30 years or so, especially, has been accumulating. The whole idea of contact. Remember that movie that was based upon Carl Sagan's view? Because at that time, they had the Drake equation, which had 20 parameters. And the Drake equation said if you had these 20 parameters fulfilled, it could be a life-sustaining planet. And so that was then the number of planets that would have life then would be in the millions and millions and millions, and of course, millions and millions, billions and billions, as he used to say. And so the idea is, in context, if you remember, Jodie Foster would say, what a waste it would be if all this stuff is just for us. What if it's, though, let's take another point of view. Suppose it took a universe this big and of this nature to create the conditions in which we could have this one conversation, you see. And it appears from growing evidence in the fine-tuning parameters that they're being so vast and so complex that the probability is, even if you had just take 100 of them, because you see the 20 was nothing, there's hundreds of them now. And if you just take just take 20 of them, the probability would be about 1 part in 10 to the 200. But that's, so even if you had 10 to the 20th planets that could be possible, that are around, 10 to the 20th is being generous, the probability then would be, okay, now it would be 1 part in 10 to the 180 against it. In other words, it's not going to happen. In other words, my view is the fine-tuning parameters are so rich and profound that this 12-inch thin biosphere, this spherical membrane of life, is all there is. It's an astonishment to me. And the more we learn, the more that's becoming supported by the exquisitely fine-tuned parameters. So here's what we have. We have this popular notion, oh, Europa seems to have water, therefore there must be life under there. There's got to be life. Nonsense. It's like saying, hey, there's silicates in the desert. Let's look for computer chips there. You see the analogy there? Only that's a computer chip is child's play compared to a bacterium, let alone, so there are no simple cells, by the way. Life is exquisitely, vastly, astonishingly complex the more we learn about it. The lipid layers in the membranes and all these other carbohydrate structures, let alone the DNA and all the organelles in the cell, they are all vastly complex and we can't understand a thing about them. Remember we talked about these machines? It's like a factory and nobody knows how it's working. But it's doing these things thousands of times a second, creating things that we can't even begin to imagine. And so what I'm suggesting here is that we are in a finely tuned context for this purpose. And it's, in my view, that the drama of redemption takes place on the stage of this little planet. And it's not a question of how big it is. Since when did size determine the value of a thing? You go to the Grand Canyon with your family, and you see the vastness and this. How many of you have been to the Grand Canyon? How many of you who went there were tempted to jump in? I wanted to fly. It was amazing. But I wasn't. I was tempted. I could be tempted, but I was not susceptible because I knew the consequences too obviously. But suppose you're seeing this glory and this vastness, and all of a sudden you discover that this toddler is missing. A 2-year-old is missing. Where is she? And suddenly the grandeur of the Grand Canyon is nothing compared to this toddler's life. You see the idea there? It's not the size of a thing that makes it important. You see, it's the love of God for the thing. And it is the love of the Father for that. Yeah. Yes.
I feel as though I have a calling to help children. And your 3 comments, what we do today echoes in eternity. We are image bearers, and God made us for a purpose. I get so frustrated because I don't think young people were able to communicate this enough. And do you have more tools and examples in order to take to young people that if they plug into the Holy Spirit, they can do anything within the world?
Yes. It's a long question for me to repeat, but he's basically saying, what tools, how can we somehow create an aspiration, an imagination, a desire, a longing for this kind of thing in subsequent generations? Because we're supposed to be generational links, aren't we? Yeah. That's the whole idea. And in doing so then, you are called to be, as an image bearer, you're called to be an agent who manifests the life of Christ in your sphere of influence. There's something about you where Christ is seen, and that other-centeredness then attracts them to that. So at least the desire is to convey and impart generational wisdom to another generation. And that's when you know our structures have eliminated almost entirely that, because no longer do we have intergenerational contexts where people had always lived before, but now it's being isolated, you see, and they're being marginalized, so older generation is no longer there. So in my view, as a father or as a grandfather, our call is to love Jesus so well that there's something about us that makes us lovable. You see, where you love them in such a way and you serve them and you pray for them. And this is the 3 things you can always do. You can love someone, pray for them, and serve them, regardless of their response. And there are going to be times when they push back, but if I am faithful in offering that up to God, may I love them and pray for them and serve them. I have to leave the outcome in God's hands. As you well know, I can't control the outcome. But I can seek to find ways in which we can do things, or tools in which we can do things. So I would say, for example, even the area of the nature of doing things in God's natural world would be a great thing to do, because in doing so, you're releasing them into His palpable, evident works, and you're revealing that, and you're getting them back into an analog world. And if I can actually draw them into that, it's a vastly richer world than the world of our own making and imaginations. There are cultural forces that are opposed to that. And here, as you can see in this little slide that I've got, we've seen this before, and more broadly than your question, but in the general answer to it, are these 4 C's, that we are called to be men of character, you see, to be men whose lives are innocent, blameless and innocent. Your moral authority will be tarnished by disobedience and by compromise. So you want to have an authenticity about you, that your word is your bond, and what you claim to be and what you are is increasingly congruent, you see. That's integrity. When your ethics and your morality match together. Your defined standard and your lived standard. So we have to be men of character, but we live in a crooked and perverse generation. If that was true of first century Rome, it's even more true, I think, than in any subsequent generation. now. We're more like that. And yet at the same time, we have a calling. How would it be? We're lights in the world, and it doesn't take much light to dispel the darkness, you see. But holding fast the word of life. So that's our calling, is you and I are called to be taking that word of God, which touched us, and to pass it on to the next. And so it goes in an unbroken succession until Christ comes. And so living with that in mind. So that there's this whole idea of living with integrity and living with a quality of character. We've talked about this before. Let me just see if I can sum it up. If I name them right, I can find it. Yes, integrity. Where the ethics are your defined standard of living, your morality is your live standard, and the integrity is the degree of overlap between the two. You see the concept there? It means, therefore, there can be a kind of a perverse standard of integrity. Don Vito Corleone had a lot of integrity. He had a low defined standard, and he lived pretty consistently with it. So that's not what we're looking for, but we want to be men of character so that more and more what you claim to believe and how you actually do live are very much the same. It's a seamless tuning. And so no one does that perfectly, but here's what happens. You're called to grow and to continue to press on. And so that's why I have this phrase I like, yesterday's faith is today's sight. What took a risk yesterday, and you saw God was faithful, guess what happens? He has to bump it up for you to grow. So we're going to call you to greater and greater risks as the day draws near. But you want to be men whose integrity is such that they can depend upon you, especially people in the Z, Generation Z, are looking for. They don't see. There's no security. There's what they need to have is something that's stable, something that doesn't move, something that is the word is the bond. That's sort of thing. A quality about you that is trustworthy, secure, safe, and that points beyond yourself to the one who's living in you and through you as you. So those are a couple thoughts on that, but there's so many things. Yeah, back there.
I want to continue with this concern question.
Yes. Yes.
Going back to the earlier teachings a few months ago,
Yes.
the question I would ask, and this is a rhetorical, you don't have to address it, but the question is, what is your deposit in prayer? How much time do you actually spend in the action and time in prayer? I have a personal experience where I've helped a daughter go through a deep depression and anorexia. Nothing happened until my wife and I were face down for hours. My question is, will the inheritance be fueled? What will your inheritance to your other generation be fueled by?
Yes. So his question is the role of prayer and how does that affect our intergenerational effectiveness? And to me, to be a man of prayer is to be a man of radical dependence who realizes that apart from God, nothing can really take place. So it's a position of radical dependence, of humility, and of seeking Him, but also knowing that His timing is not mine, and His ways are not mine. So what I have to do is recalibrate so that I reconnect with where He is calling me to be. But that's why I'm very big on prayer. And so Handbook to Prayer is, in fact, we need to talk about this again, how we can make this a thing that we do around the tables, whereby we are using Handbook to Prayer on a regular basis, because it's such a huge theme to me. And it's not just that, we can talk about that later and do it around the tables, but because if I can get you to become people who are praying scripture back to God and have a balanced diet, you're going to see that the Spirit, you're going to be open to the work in the power of the Spirit. But the other thing I want to emphasize, and we've talked about this before, is the whole idea of practicing His presence, which is in formal times of prayer. So you have both the formal times that you were describing, but then there are informal times when throughout the course of the day, you're walking in such a way that you're, remember the 3 words, trusting the Father, abiding in the Son, and walking by the Spirit. So that now your life becomes a prayer, you see, because then you're open to the surprising prompts of the Spirit of God, and who will then prompt you to shoot up a prayer at a particular time for a person. But there's no formulaic modality whereby, oh, if he did this, so I should do that, because it's not always the same. You see, the solutions, that was what you needed to do, being on your face in desperation. But it'll be different. There's no formula. God does things uniquely through people in unique ways. But the fundamental themes are these, that we want to be increasingly dependent upon the purposes of God. Walking by the Spirit means allowing yourself to be responsive to the little hints, the little prompts. And may I submit to you in this manner, this theme, that obedience is actually the pathway, the portal to intimacy with God. Obedience is the portal to apprehending His presence. And that's the risk of obedience that requires it, because it goes countercultural and it's counterintuitive. But so prayer is a huge theme, I must agree. But what prayer, remember, is really a dialogue. And it's a lifestyle, and it's supposed to be something that is our dynamic of communication and communion with the living God. We don't know how to pray as we should, it tells us in Romans 8, doesn't it? But the Spirit Himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. So even here, we must be open to the prompts of the Spirit and then agree with that. And so how He does this. So when I pray for my grandsons, and I want these things for them, but I have to look to Him. He knows what they need and when they need it and how I am to respond to them. Sometimes I'm prompted to do a thing, and listen to those quiet little prompts of the Spirit so that you can, then that becomes part of your prayer. It becomes all of life becomes a prayer in that sense. It becomes a communication, a communion with God. Again, these are huge, wonderful questions. I'm trying to be a good boy and keep my answers short.
Moving
Now
art.
go to you next, yes.
Moving art.
Oh, moving art, that would be good. Okay, hold that thought, because he had this question, I should be, okay, I'll remember that.
Maybe you can do this next week. I began to look into the Bible at an individual, and it was Abraham. And the 4 ways God tested him, and how his journey through those testing phases got him to the point where God said to Abraham, "Now I know that you love me." But God knew from the beginning what Abraham was probably going to do. So, I guess it's just more of an awareness of why the scriptures contain the life of Abraham, and how we in our time would even respond to the conversation that those 2 had between themselves, and Abraham's response to it, to me, is just a little bit over my head.
You're talking about a man who is unique in God's purposes, that he was the only one in the Hebrew Bible called a friend of God. So there's a real intimacy, isn't there, in a connection. What do we learn from Abraham? Well, one thing we do learn is that no 2 people are the same. There's this whole idea, the whole idea of learning from these patriarchs, these characters. What wisdom, what insight do we gain? How do I adapt that to my own life? Where you see, and how there are some fundamental principles that are going through this course. And one of the most wonderful things is that this one who was called a friend of God, now I call you friends. You see, no longer do I call you servants, but you become my friends. So here, to be a friend, to be close to Him, to have a sense of intimacy and communion and so forth, requires an aspiration and a desire. So remember what I've been saying so many times, you become conformed to that to which you aspire. You are shaped by your desires. What do you seek? Jesus asked that first question, is your great question. What do you want most? So God says, what is the desire of your heart? So if he were to come up with you and say, I'll give you one wish, what would it be? Well, what would be your greatest wish? And that is a determination, so that because I am shaped by my desire, and the heart always finds room for that which it treasures. It'll always make room for things it treasures. So is Abraham's illustration, the Lord, he is my treasure. And this idea as well in the Psalms, apart from you, I desire nothing. You are, the nearness of God is my good. That's a great concept, isn't it? To make that the nearness of God, your good. Good grief, we're out of time. It's 7:59. So that went fast. Well, let's stop and consider where we went. We talked about prophecy, we talked about our country, we talked about prayer, we talked about our transgenerational influence, we talked about this whole spiritual formation, we talked about heaven, we talked about all kinds of stuff. So the beauty is, we'll have, in the ages to come, we'll have boundless opportunity to look into this. And in your resurrected body, as I often say, you're going to have a flat forehead. You're going to say, how did I miss it? How did I miss it? It was in front of you all along.